believe me or not, your viewers or the players, they can see your fear if you show it in your brush. Welcome to another episode of the Super Art Power Hour, where we give you the tools to power up your art. I'm Phillip Zhang, a principal environment artist on Team Fat Tactics. For today's episode, I'm gonna show you what I do at work, which is starting something from scratch, using concept sketches, and take it all the way to finished 3D assets in-game. Let's roll. The thematic we're choosing is gonna be set 17, Space God. We're taking players to a whimsical version of super colorful space and meet the space gods. We're picking Zilean as a god that's not on the roster for the live game, but we really like him, and we can make up a little story of Ekko take over Zilean's place as a time god, and Zilean's shrine is all forgotten, buried in sand. That's the kind of idea we're going for.
All in good time.
As you can see here, we have 3 sketches, and from here, we're gonna be picking one and develop it into a 3D asset in the TFT style. Also want to mention, this is the 13th episode of Super Art Power Hour. There are other 12 episodes out there featuring different aspects of game production pipeline, from animation to 2D concept to 3D character modeling. So if you're interested, please go check them out. All right, action. Before we start, just to clarify, we're not going to ship what we create today, okay? We're not going to be seeing Zilean as a new god in set 17. What we do here is kind of a demo of how we create things for TFT, and it's nothing but a creative exercise. As you can see here, I have prepared some sketches for today because in real life, this process will take at least 2 to 3 days. Out of the 3 options, my favorite is actually number 2 because the shape feels more unique. However, I'm gonna be going with option 3 today, and here's my reasoning. If you look at option 1, it's kind of cool, but it feels really sci-fi-ish. It doesn't really fit the whimsical set 17 space god idea very well. So we're probably not gonna go with that one. And for option 2, although the shape looks really interesting, the thing is, when you look at this sketch, it doesn't register immediately as a Zilean shrine. It could be Senna's gun or Galio's wing or something. So as a player, you wouldn't be able to recognize what this is within the first second when you look at it. And that, to us developers, is a big problem, because we as visual communicators have to communicate our ideas visually, and our viewers need to understand what they're looking at within the first second. And that is why I think option 3 would be the best, although it feels a little basic, safe, whatever you call it. It is something that, when you look at it as a player, you immediately understand, okay, this is something about Zilean, the character. And to us, this is very important. So yeah, let's take options 3. And as you can see here, I have prepared options 3 a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and start to pen on top of this and explain my process. For today, I'm gonna be mainly using 3 softwares. I'm gonna be doing my 2D concept in Photoshop, and the 3D modeling will be handled in Maya, and the texture painting will be in 3D Coat. And for hardware, here's my trustworthy 24-inch Cintiq Pro that I've been using for years. Cut. To start, I'm gonna be quickly blocking in some light and shadow. That's always gonna be the step number 1. You wanna establish a lighting direction. In this case, we're gonna say the lighting comes from this angle. And from here, we're gonna be adding some cast shadows accordingly. At this stage, do not feel pressured to get to the perfect edge, the perfect line, or anything like that. It doesn't matter. Okay, we're trying to really quickly capturing the overall lighting scheme. We can always kind of go back and clean up things later on if we need. It is also important to remember that when you paint, try to use an opaque brush. You can see here I have my opacity as 100%. That is very important because, for one, it makes you work a lot faster when you use an opaque brush, and also simply the fact that you are not really wasting too much time just going back and forth with your brushes can make your brushwork feel a lot more confident. And believe me or not, your viewers or the players, they can see your fear if you show it in your brush. If you repeat your brush too much, like they'll know that you're not sure what you're doing, you're being indecisive. Try to pick a hard brush and just go with the flow. Even if you make a mistake, don't worry about it. They say fake it until you make it. That's kind of the idea. Just very quickly, I'm blocking in all the shadow shapes. As you can see, I'm not just picking the local color and going for like a darker version of it, because that's very boring, right? Like we don't want to do like a monochromatic scene, not for TFT. Like what is TFT without all the colors? That is something we're proud of and use playful colors and stuff. I use a very, very old school hard round brush. As you can see here, this is one of the default Photoshop brush, and it's very useful. Like I said, it's a opaque round brush that allows me, or I should say forces me to, make a decision every time I put my brush down on the canvas. Like I can't really try to blend anything because it's opaque. And because of that, I can really, use it to like design the shapes and try to kind of get like an overall gesture really quickly. So that's the main brush I'm using. I'm also, well, I guess I have several brushes, but usually for something like this, I'll stick with just a hard round brush. I think for rendering, if you're not super sure about something, that's okay. Just go with it and you can fix it later. We really need to think about what is the most important thing in the composition. Like usually for TFT, the answer is UI and VFX. And character comes second, and environment art should always be sort of the backdrop. I've been at Riot for about 6 years now. I started on League of Legends, and if you ever kill an Earth Dragon, those little rocks that pops out around the SR map, that is actually my first task when I started on the League of Legends team. But very quickly, I moved to TFT, which back then was a very small pod with like 2 rows of desks. The game was very successful, and it was expanding very quickly over the years. Now we are a very big project. I am literally creating living and breathing worlds for our players, and that part definitely brings me joy. And the fact that every time when we launch a new set, I'll just kind of log in as a regular player and kind of ask in the chat like, hey, what do you think about the new set? What do you think about the scene? And I'll always be hearing about positive feedback like, oh, we love the thematic, we love this carousel. And that always brings me joy. Years ago, when I look at TFT for the first time, when I opened that game, I saw like a group of champions walking in a circle in the carousel. And my first reaction was, what the heck is this game? Why are they walking in circles? And set 17 is actually the first time that we start to like reimagine the carousel. For every TFT set, we will try something different, something unique. Sometimes it can be, augment cards, a larger champion pool. We listen to players' feedback, and sometimes we keep certain features as evergreen. At the same time, there's no promise that we will keep certain things for forever. For example, the carousel for set 17 is like a reimagined marketplace or realm of the god. However, there is no promise that we will be making like entirely different carousel for all future TFT sets. Like everything else in TFT, it is experiment, and we like to keep experimenting new exciting ways to make TFT more fun. I mean, one thing I really love about TFT is that for every single set we are exploring a very, very different art style in a different universe within the Convergence. And some of my favorites would be, well, I'm gonna be a little biased here. I think the KDA arena would be one of my favorite things to work on, because that was the first time I actually get to create the arena from concept all the way to finish. And I also really enjoyed working on the set 14, the Cyber City carousel, because I always loved the cyberpunk art style. I think Space Gods was also fun set to work on, mostly because they have so much like exciting new features. I really enjoyed designing those pedestals for each god, and everything feels refreshing and unique. You can see here I have quickly applied some like cast shadows to the prop, and now the second step would be trying to think about the lighting. We want to think about how the light would affect the golden plates. For that part, I would actually start with an airbrush just to kind of quickly get a little bit of bloom. Now we're getting into the second part of this rendering. As you can see, we have some lighting and some shadow. And now we're gonna work on the ground, you know, the rock, those little plants, and work on the sand a little bit. Like, I'm not looking for like a super polished illustration, obviously. Like, this is just like a concept art, right? Like, it's for myself in a way, just so that I don't have to reimagine things in 3D as if I got lost in the forest, you know? I think making changes in 2D is always a lot easier than making changes in 3D. I always prefer to have a concept art before I start in the 3D process, or later on you'll see that if I get feedback on my 3D asset, I'll actually take a screenshot of it and bring it to 2D, do a quick pen over, and then apply the changes back to the 3D asset. It just feels a lot more smooth that way, just because in 3D, if I want to change a thing, I have to change the model, change the UV, change, you know, a whole bunch of things. Well, in 2D, I just need to, you know, like this, do a couple strokes and done. Easy, right? One important thing to think about is, you know, the contrast of big, medium, and small. I definitely do not want to have those shapes all being the same size, because, you know, half and half shapes always tend to compete against each other and make the painting look bad. Say like this one is big, I want to make this this shape like bigger, and this one will be a small, and this will be the medium. So, and this one will be like the huge. You always want to kind of create this kind of rhythm when you paint, so that your stuff do not look too dull and boring. Yeah, a lot of times when I give pen overs to other people, the first thing I'll fix in their image would be the half and half shapes. Because believe it or not, they're super difficult to get rid of. I don't know, I think that has to do with just we as humans like really love to see half and half shapes. If you imagine a drawing done by a little kid, that little flower, the house, the sun, the tree, like all those elements will be about the same size in that image. And it's almost like it's pre-programmed. It's pretty strange. I don't know why. But as professional artists, we have to retrain our brain to learn to not do that. In other words, avoid half and half shapes with everything we got. And you'll be surprised like how much better your painting or drawing will look if you manage to just eliminate all the half and half shapes. As I'm painting like light and shadow, I'm also getting rid of all the line work, because I feel like line work is important in the early stage. You know, it's very informative when you look at the line work and know exactly what shapes you are dealing with. But later on, they can be sort of hurting the final result, especially if you want to translate this into 3D. At one point, it's better to get rid of the line work and use value to communicate. I think the best way to do that is actually just simply collapse the line work as part of the base layer. As you can see, this is the line work is actually baked onto the rock. And I'm just gonna paint on top and respecting what the line work is suggesting. Like over here, like this line to me is suggesting a face that's almost kind of doing this, like in 3D. So I'm gonna use my value to show like how that form is changing in 3D. So when you're painting, remember you're working on a 2D image, but you are trying to tell the story in 3D. So everything you do will have to be somehow creating that volumetric illusion, you know, through the correct use of lighting, a good sense of perspective, most importantly, the shape flow. So what is the shape flow? You've probably heard me mentioning that term for quite a few times now. When we zoom out and look at this image as a whole, can you see that this area is obviously the main focal point? And I'm using a lot of lines to kind of guide your eyes around, but, you know, kind of framing this part as a main focal point. Well, that is one of many ways to create shape flow. And there are also like subtle ways of, you know, shapes that are pointing at this main focal point. You can see those bushes, they're all kind of pointing the viewer's eyes and kind of telling them like, hey, go look at this area. This is a main focal point. That's a simple way to explain what shape flow is. There can be more nuance in it. We'll talk about it later. And remember, you don't have to get rid of all the line work, because again, this is not going to be a leak splash art on the loading screen, you know? Like, no one's going to see this except for yourself. Like, you're just trying to like solve all the problems that you might encounter when you turn this into 3D, and that's it. You don't have to make sure everything is like super polished, super clean. It doesn't matter. Remember to zoom out when you paint, and do not worry about the small details. It is interesting that in art history, a lot of great painters, Monet included, got a lot better at painting in a later age when their vision started to fade. And because they couldn't see very clearly, they stopped looking at all the small details and start to focus more on the big picture, and that's how they got better. Kind of weird, right? Like details, small details, trust me, they do not matter. If you say look at this golden plate right here, we have the lighting established, right? If you look at the black and white, I can literally just go in and do a bunch of like squibbly lines like this, you see? And when I zoom out, they start to feel like details. Details is nothing but an illusion. Do not spend your time, do not waste your time on like small details, like zooming in and try to like paint all those like intricate little corners, little highlights. Don't do that, okay? Focus on the big picture. That's the important part. So shape flow happens at multiple levels. Remember I was saying like, you know, those big shapes would have a flow. As you are designing those shadows within the cast shadow, like those actual like shadow shapes or reflection shapes, you can still create interesting shape flow. By doing that, you know, your viewers might not be able to notice right away, but your image as a whole would start to have more energy. It's subtle, but it slowly builds up. Here you can see a reference board I made. Here we have the Shurima and Zilean from, I think, Wild Rift. I choose this skin because it has the sand and, you know, gold theme already, which I think naturally ties to Ekko in set 17, which also has like the sand and gold. That's why I choose this skin. And here you can see some other reference where I'm referencing the, you know, color, the shape of the plant, stuff like that. I need to mention that this is probably less than 10% of what I would usually gather. And my message to all the artists is that please go gather enough reference before you start, because your visual library is nothing compared to Pinterest or any image website. You know, you can have so much like cool visuals that are just there waiting for you, and you just need to, you know, search and be inspired. And of course, you don't want to copy anyone's design, right? You're taking ideas from those images. You know, it can be a certain shape language, a way of using color and light, or anything that just kind of draws your attention, you know? Since I was a student, environment art has always been my passion, mostly because it has infinite amount of potential in terms of storytelling. With a character, of course, you can tell a lot of story, but if it's environment, the possibility is almost infinite. If you think about it, within this simple like diorama sketch, there's so much I can say. I can say, you know, those rocks has been there for centuries, and it's already like chipped and damaged by the hot weather. If I want to tell even more story, I can even say like, oh look, there are actually some fossils underneath. So you know like Mount Everest, like the highest part of Mount Everest actually has seashell fossils, meaning like at one point they were buried underneath the sea. Like stuff like that are, you know, small things we can sneak into our environment. The thing is, you know, if you want to add a new gear to a character, a lot of people will be looking at it and give you feedback, and very likely you'll have to change it. But for environment, for like small things like this, I do it all the time and almost no one cares. I get to tell my own story to, you know, millions of players, which is, I think, a great perk of this job. Like within this sand, right now it's just like basic sand, right? What if we, you know, sprinkle in a little bit of crystals? Because this is not a place on Earth. Remember, we're trying to create something for set 17, the space gods. You know, if this is a high fantasy place somewhere far, far away, in theory, we can do anything. We always need some kind of small element in the scene to show the scale. Because imagine if we don't have those plants at all, when you look at this, you as a player or as a viewer can be confused. How big is a player? Is it going to be this big or this big or this big? You don't know, right? But with those plants as a kind of a reference of scale, you kind of get it. You can be like, okay, with a plant of that size, I guess a player character would be something like that. So remember to always add some small elements. It don't have to be plants, but you know, something that players can reference for skill, and by using them, you can actually make your main focal point, in this case, the sand disk / the gadget Zilean carries on his back, to look more prominent. And again, do not worry about small details, focusing on shapes, focusing on gesture. And that is especially true for plants, because as a player, I'm sure you have played many video games. Have you ever walked close up to a tree or a plant and look at the texture? I bet you didn't, unless you're an environment artist like me. And the thing is, people don't care about plants, and that's okay. You know, plants are supposed to be the backdrop that are not grabbing too much attention. And because of that, it is okay to keep the plants, you know, relatively simple in texture and geometry, but we really, really need to focus on the gesture. Like, you kind of have to give them a very elegant, very cool gesture, so that even from afar, even in your peripheral vision, you can still see those interesting gestures. As you can see, we did an overall pass to all the elements. Here's a before and after. We're getting somewhere. I'll briefly show how I will kind of project this into 3D. It's always kind of satisfying to use color dodge to add those juicy highlights, but please do not get carried away by those, okay? Without a solid value structure, they will not hold up. I set my hotkey for like checking black and white scale as F1. So if you go here, you can see, yeah, it's a view, go to color setup. Over here, I have S gray as my, you know, way to check the black and white value, like change the device to simulate to S gray. Then I set the hotkey to F1. So whenever I press F1, I can turn the whole thing to a black and white and check my value structure. Value structure, composition, like those fundamental things are the foundation of a building. That color dodge that we just added is nothing but like a fancy statue on top of that tower, you know. It doesn't stand if the foundation is shaking. Okay, I think for 2D concept, this is close enough. I don't want to spend too much time in 2D concept, just because we'll have to repaint everything in 3D anyway. As you can see here, I have already prepared a 3D scene because we can't make this live. It's gonna take too long. And I have already imported this 3D scene into 3D code right here. So now we have the 2D concept. What we're gonna do is we're gonna go to edit, projections. So you can see here we have like a projection of the 3D model. And we basically are just gonna grab what we have, drag it over. I mean, it's not gonna be one for one, that's for sure, but you know, it's kind of a starting point. It's better than nothing, right? At least that's how I like to start. I'm just gonna move things around a little bit, try to like get it as close as possible so that I have a starting point when I go to 3D. Okay, that's close enough. I'm just gonna hit save, and in 3D code, we're gonna get a pretty rough projection. Like I said, it's better than nothing. Okay, now we're gonna clean this up real quick and continue painting. As you can see, I'm quickly just closing those unprojected areas and cleaning up the texture. We have pretty much closed all the gaps, and now things are more cleaned up. So starting from here, we're gonna be actually starting to try to render the texture. As you can see here, we have the concept right here. It's pretty much 1-for-1 in terms of the level of detailing, but the goal moving forward would be make this piece a lot more detailed than the concept. Like the concept is nothing but a blueprint, and starting from here, we want to be pushing it to the next level and the next level. So in 3D code, you have this thing called paint objects. If you don't want a certain part to be affected, you can just lock it. So as you can see, I locked the plant. So if I just paint on top, the plant will not be affected. So to make this work, when you export in Maya or whatever 3D program you're using, you have to make sure like, you know, every single thing you want to separate will be its own group, its own asset group, so that when you export, you just select all those asset groups and hit export. That way, 3D code will interpret them as asset groups over here. It just makes your life a little easier. We just have like a really quick base that somehow make the whole thing feel more grounded and make the asset stand out a little more. On top of that, let's start rendering. So the first thing I like to do in this case would actually be starting to add sharp edges. What do I mean by that? If you think about rendering texture, like essentially what you are doing is you are trying to make the texture feel more polished, more finished, right? And how do we make something look more finished? The answer is not to add more details. I can tell you that straight away, because earlier on in this video, I already showed you like the squiggly lines, right? Like remember, even those squiggly shapes can be read as details when we zoom out. It doesn't matter if we have, you know, those small details or not. The image, you know, should look cool with or without them. But what's important is actually sharp edges, because for whatever reason, like we will read every single sharp edge as some kind of polished detail. You see how I cleaned up this part? Those are like just some like carvings on this like metal ring. By adding a sharp edge here, and when we zoom out, you can see that they start to look like a sharp detail versus this part, right? And that's the kind of thing we want to be doing moving forward by a lot. And of course, while adding those sharp details, we also want to think about their shapes and how those shapes would interacting with each other. So I guess a lot of it really comes down to your understanding of shapes and composition. It gets extremely complicated when it comes to understanding the art fundamentals such as, you know, shape design, composition, and those are things you should be focusing on. And you know, if you're interested to work in the stylized hand-painted game industry, those are the things recruiters will be looking for. So yeah, you have to be a decent painter in order to work in this art style. One great way to practice is to keep a sketchbook and try to do some sketches every day. I mean, you probably have heard about this one from multiple people. I have definitely heard about it from like multiple teachers when I was a student. I never really did it, to be honest, due to, you know, homework, you know, being busy with life and all that. But some years back, maybe 5 years ago, when I actually started to keep a sketchbook with me and try to do like at least one sketch a day, my understanding of composition, like my ability to control my hand to create interesting shapes, actually changed, developed by quite a bit. It was so surprising to me to see that change. I was like, whoa, that's it, you know? Because by the end of the days, when you think about it, it doesn't matter if you're doing 3D modeling or if you're doing like texture painting. Every single stroke you put down, every single, you know, vert you pull in the 3D program is essentially about you making artistic decision on what do you want that shape to look like, right? Which is now different from you holding a sketchbook trying to draw a human figure or a flower or whatever. So that process of just, on a daily basis, keep training that part of your brain and just, build up that muscle memory is going to make a huge difference. And please trust me on this one. So as texture painters, we really have to reimagine what we see in the concept. Very often, the concept we get would be a great starting point with, good atmosphere, good overall composition, but there are going to be a lot of smaller parts that are still kind of ambiguous, and we as texture painters or 3D hand-painted artists will have to reimagine, kind of interpret the concept and find a way to, translate it into 3D textures. And that to me is always the fun part. That's a part that I can sit there and do for like long hours, because like I said, you have a lot of freedom when it comes to like how would you want to like reinvent or interpret the concept. You can pretty much do whatever you want. And in my career, I would say for the first maybe like 7 to 8 years, I was mostly using other people's concept. I mean, sometimes I get to do my own, but not very often. Later down the road, I started to create my own concept more and more, and that also really trained my brain to sort of build a deeper understanding in like how this workflow actually works. If you can do concept, even like really, really rough concept art, your texture painting skill will improve by quite a bit, because when you're doing texture painting, you're basically creating a concept using a 3D canvas, right? Like this is your canvas and you're basically doing 2D painting. You don't have to, worry about bring this to ZBrush and build a high poly and bake it down as low poly and all that. Those are not necessary for this workflow, because as you can see here, we're just, starting with the low poly straight down and trying to get the textures to work together. If you ever want to make changes on your 3D model, in the PBR workflow, if you want to change this model, it can create quite a bit of problem, right? But for our case, it's actually super easy, because imagine we just want to make this plant bigger as an example. We can just select the whole thing, hit export, and go back to 3D code, and hit import or replace geometry, and it will live update. And that is something that's very, very convenient down the road, which I'll show you in a bit. Like again, we're just painting on a 3D canvas, but we're essentially doing 2D art. That's how I see it. You see like those low poly rocks are clipping into the terrain here. We don't have to respect that edge, because that will make it feel very low poly, right? We can actually paint on top of that edge and just kind of break it up so that from afar it starts to feel more organic. For games like TFT, where we have to consider that a lot of our players will be using their phone to play, we have to think about the topology and texture resolution as well, right? We can't go too high on both, because they will greatly affect the gameplay experience of our players. When you think about it, TFT's camera angle is pretty much fixed. It's either like this or from the opponent's view like this, right? Like people can't really rotate anyway. You can totally get away with a little bit of smoke and mirror like that. Forget about the actual edge and make the painting feel more organic. Also, when I say like use a lot of hard edges to get details, please don't get me wrong, okay? We actually need a good balance between hard and soft edges, because if every single edge is sharp, then it will just make the whole thing feel very stiff, and that's not what we want. Another thing to consider, of course, is a warm and cool. Usually for like a scene like this, I mean, this time we're in space, so it's hard to say, but usually assuming this is sunlight, we'll say the sunlight is slightly cooler than like interior light. So we'll most likely be using this teal or blue color for the sunlight, just like a lot of the traditional plein air painting. You know, if you look at Pissarro or Van Gogh, like they tend to use a lot of cool colors in the sunlight. And to contrast that, we can actually use a decent amount of warm colors in the shadow, juicy colors, right? And that's something TFT is really, really proud of. Is we go crazy with our usage of colors. That's, in my opinion, a big part of the charm of the game. At Riot, well, on TFT team, we usually have 3 production gates. The first production gate is block out. Consider this low poly model plus unwrapped UV, something like this, plus some base texture be the block out stage. Like that's a part where we are just kind of getting things in and get the different colors in place and see how they work together. And the second part, which is kind of like what I'm doing now, is called early production. And in this stage, we're starting to clean up the textures, finalize the shapes, but still a lot of things are still open for interpretation or still super open for feedback, and we're ready to change things if needed. And then the third stage would be the polish stage. And once we get to the polish stage, the message to the team is that, hey, we're in polish stage, and if you have some kind of big feedback of, hey, this composition doesn't work, let's change this disc into something else, we will reserve the ability to say thank you, but no, it's a bit too late, we have to ship this, maybe next time. And I think that is a very healthy way of dealing with feedback. It's like, as a team, we want to collaborate as much as we can, right? Like, we want to take other people's feedback in block out and early production stage. At the same time, we're a group of game developers with a project to ship. We can't just work on, different people's feedback for forever. At one point, we have to sort of do the last call and close the gate so we can actually polish something and ship it to the players. You might be looking at this demo and be like, oh my god, how can Phillip paint so fast? Like, I will spend like a whole day and can't even get to, the first part of this. And please remember this, like, I was just as slow as you might be right now, or worse. And it took me a long time, a ton of trials and errors for me to understand what I'm doing. And, after years of doing this, I've been doing hand-painted texture for 12 years now, by the way. When I pick a color, I know exactly what that color would do. When I put a value down, to a certain part, I know exactly why should I pick this value instead of another one. And all of those experience just comes from, practice. I don't have any shortcut or any secret. And I can tell you this, like, I, over the past 10, 20 years of being an artist, being an art student, have seen many talented artists, a lot of top tier people. And one thing they share in common is they all have spent a crazy amount of time to like really honing their craft. I don't think there's a single person who just woke up one day, got bit by a spider or something, and start painting like a pro artist. That's not possible. My message to 19-year-old me before I start my career would actually be, you'll never be ready, quotation mark. Because opportunities, challenges will come at your way before you prepare for it. Like this demo, for example. Like, I was busy finishing up a set and a bunch of other work when I was contacted to do this demo, and I know I wasn't ready. Like, I knew I barely have time to prepare for this, but I said yes anyway. Because to my experience, whenever opportunities or challenges like this, come in my way, the power of universe will never let me prepare for it. But if I say yes and just take on it, I will always get something good out of it. And that's what I believe. And that's what I've been doing for the past 15 years. Well, I meet a lot of like younger artists who always say like, oh, what, I really want to work for Riot one day, but I'm not prepared for it. I'm not ready for it. Or, oh, I want to enter this contest, but I need to, keep honing my skills for another couple years before I do. And I always tell them like, hey, just do it. Sorry, Nike. Like you'll never be ready for anything in the sense that you are fully prepared and you just enter and win. That's not how life works. Visual hierarchy is something my art director talks about a lot. What it means is that if you think about TFT, it's actually kind of a crazy game. On like a small cell phone screen, you have dozens of units, environment, VFX, a ton of UI, augment cards, and all those cool like spell effects. Everything's trying to like screaming for attention. And as a TFT developer, it is very important for us to kind of maintain that visual hierarchy so players do not just look at a mass, right? And the secret to that is to maintain the value range and the color range. You can see over here we have this color wheel, right? Usually for environment art, we do not go too dark or too bright. As you can see, the darkest dark I have is over here instead of here. And the lightest light is actually over here instead of all the way up. That way, by keeping all the environment values and colors in this range, I get to tap into some of the juiciest colors the nature has to offer. And also, I avoid the darkest dark and the lightest light. So overall, like my painting has this very buttery, very creamy kind of look, which is one of the secrets to capture the painterly style. And for characters, you can have a little more allowance in the value range. You can go a little darker, a little brighter, but not too much. And for UI, VFX, that kind of stuff, they can go from black to white. And by keeping this kind of visual hierarchy, can focus on maintaining like a good readability across different TFT elements, so that although in every single TFT game there are a lot happening, you can always be able to you can always see the UI, the VFX over the units, over the environment. And that is something we're very carefully trying to maintain. And of course, since TFT is both a PC and a mobile game, we always have to consider that not everyone is playing using like the most up-to-date PC out there. So we have to maintain our poly count. As you can see, like the topology here is pretty low, especially for 2026 standard. But that is something we have to do just to make sure that everyone has access to the game and can experience the game in a good way. And also texture resolution. We usually would keep our textures pretty small, just so that they do not take too much memory away. Alright guys, so I'm in this art review call right now. The art director and the design director just play tested this new stage that I built, and I'm getting some feedback. Wait, what? You mean more color? Okay, yeah, we can do that, definitely. It's TFT, so we can go crazy with color. Why not? It does feel a little too Shurima, not spacey enough. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I can work on that. I can see like why just one plant is kind of boring. I guess I'll make a couple more, and yeah, we can play with big, medium, small, and have like some like lower level plants and some tall ones. Color wise, I can try to incorporate more colors in other parts, but we have to keep the golden disc as a golden disc. Cool hat, by the way. I like your dress. It is very normal for us to receive feedback in the middle of production. And in situations like this, what I would do is actually just take a screenshot and go to Photoshop. Because remember, we do not want to change things in 3D. That can be pretty complicated. So what I would do is just crop the file. Here is a screenshot of what we have. And we have 3 feedback. The first one is the thing looks too terrestrial. We want to make it feel more like outer space. I think the answer to that would be probably adding a bit of extra color to the rock, making them feel almost like some kind of translucent crystal. And we can also add more crystal debris on the ground, just so that, yeah, this place can feel more like a outer space desert, not somewhere on Earth, or Runeterra in this case. Another feedback is to add more color, which is something we like to do for a lot of TFT assets. We want to use vibrant colors to like really amp up that playful feeling. We can definitely do a pass on that. And also, I think we need some secondary, tertiary plants so that this is not the only plant in the scene. So we have this, and we have the in-game. Okay, you see, once you give the ground a little bit of color of the grass, they start to feel a lot more natural, like a lot more integrated. That's just another environment art production trick. And you might want to ask, like, why are we making those changes in the middle of production? And the truth is, this is something we do, well, not every day, but definitely every week. Because a common thing that a lot of students and aspiring artists would assume is that in order to, get in the studio and be a production artist, you just need to be really good at art. Well, that's true. You have to be good at art, but also you have to be able to work with people and address their feedback. That is huge, because your willingness to listen and work with other people's ideas, because it's never going to be you sitting in your room making the art, right? In the end, TFT, League of Legends, or most of the games out there are created by a large group of very, very talented people. And those people, like, they give each other feedback and they inspire each other. That's a big part of it. One way to look at feedback is that you are the driver who's driving the car, and there are a bunch of people sitting in the back seats trying to give you directions. You have to listen to some of them, but you can't listen to everyone because too many cooks. I would say that is a skill that we all have to develop, and it's kind of a combination of art skill and communication, your people skill combined together. And from my personal experience, I tend to give a lot of people, pen overs and like quick feedbacks, helping them on their projects. And it is always important to know like how you deliver the feedback too. You want to be constructive. You want to give them a very clear vision so that they can understand where you're coming from. Yeah, the way I like to think at this stage is, although I'm painting with, a brush within 3D code, but I imagine myself sculpting in ZBrush using like a clay buildup or clay polish brush, if you know what I'm talking about. And I'm trying to like create those very interesting subsurface so that, the subject I'm painting is less of a perfect shape, with more like little dents and, little like cracks and some color accents. I think by doing that, we can just kind of make them a little more fun to look at. If I can pick a TFT world to live in, because every set we create an entirely different world. My personal preference would be set 14, the Sever City. I know that TFT serves a lot of players from all around the world, and many of them would prefer like a more bright, more colorful palette. For me personally though, like I really love the rain, the moody neon lights. I think that's just a super, super cool thematic, and I really enjoyed working on it. When you play a game, you kind of want to experience something that's very different from the mundane life you're living, right? In TFT, every 4 months will take players to a different place. It could be somewhere in space, it could be KO Arena, it could be anything. And the fact that when you first log into the game and see the environment, you can briefly sort of escape from your day-to-day life and experience something that's entirely new is magical. And to me, I think, for me as a player, that's what I always want to see, that's what I'm always looking for in video games. It's those worlds that can take me and my imagination away on a wild trip. When you design a prop or a diorama like this, do not see it as a bunch of props. Imagine you're designing a character, and that character has personality. When I was creating this scene, I was thinking about Zilean, the character, this sort of rigid old man who holds the power to travel through time. And, like, I kind of want to add this vibe to the scene I'm creating, although you cannot see Zilean's figure here. You can kind of see how his personality is manifesting this environment. And whenever you feel stuck designing a certain prop or creating a certain thing, that's usually because you're having a harder time to like connect to a specific tree or chair. The trick is actually to imagine whatever you're creating as a character, and that way you'll naturally feel more excited and you'll have more ideas. One important thing to always think about is avoid half and half shapes. Like you see those two rocks, this one and this one, and this one, you see how 3 of them are looking very similar in sizes? That is not good. They are considered half and half shapes because they will be competing against each other, and you as a viewer will have a hard time to understand which one to look at first. And we will want to say, like, make one a lot bigger, another one smaller, and this one being the medium. I know this sounds pretty easy, but it's actually a lot harder than you think, because we tend to create a lot of half and half shapes when we work. And one thing to remember is always keep your shapes as simple as possible. Less is more, and try to use the minimum amount of elements to create the most stunning visual, because the more shapes, the more random shapes and colors you introduce, the more redundant the image would feel and the weaker it would actually be. And a good example would be thinking about the design of like iPhone or iPod. They have very, very simple shapes, and there's usually just one button or no button at all. And because of that, they have this very strong graphic rate, help them to like really stand out. We can do things very, very similarly in 3D environment or any kind of visual art. It doesn't matter if you're doing character, environment, VFX, whatnot. Try to use less shapes, less color, and that way your product will pack a stronger visual impact. Now we're kind of looking at pretty close to finish version of this, and there's one more thing I really want to show you guys. That is, we can always export this to Photoshop by press Ctrl P for export, and I'm gonna save this file as Zilean texture. And I'm just gonna use Photoshop for now. And if we go to our Maya file, we can then make a new material. As you can see, now we have this 3D scene in Maya with texture applied. Some of the details we painted are not fully supported by the geometry. You see, like, the rock geometry still feels very basic. It doesn't really follow the shape of those painted details, right? What we can do right now is to actually cut out some of those details. Like, we don't have to do all of them. Having some of them being actually supported by the actual geometry can make this feel a lot cooler. As you can see, we can do something like this. We can literally just pull this over a little bit, and for here, we can just kind of move this part up. Maybe we can even choose to like collapse those So by doing this pass, we can really kind of marry the texture with our geometry so that the final product can feel very cohesive. And by the way, like this is usually the final part before we ship the asset, because imagine if you have to change the texture after this, like dramatically change the layout of the texture, you're gonna have to redo what we just did here. Usually that's not worth it, so I'll usually leave this part to the very last. Once we're done with this, we can select the whole thing, export again, and bring it back into 3D code. And here we are. As you can see, we have all those geometry updates. So now we can paint more, update geometry, or add more detail, whatever we want. So yeah, before we wrap up, I actually want to show you the whole process of what we did today. In the very beginning, we started with some sketches, and within those sketches, we decided to pick the third option. From here, we moved on to rendering the sketch a little bit. And from here, we projected the texture over to 3D code. And within 3D code, we started painting. And at one point, we got some art director feedback about there's not enough color. The scene feels a little too terrestrial, and also we need more plants. So we did a pan over and added a lot of colors, more plants, more material, and we applied all the changes, and here we are. Sign my name. I'll change this to a P, and this is a Z. I gotta say, I'm kind of impressed by the speed that I have today. Normally something like this will take me 2 to 3 days to paint, and today, maybe because of all the coffee I drank, I actually went pretty fast. So obviously this is not 100% finished. If I had more time, I will be going in and try to like clean up even more edges, add even more subtle shapes. Yeah, so I can easily spend another 3 or 4 hours just to wrap everything up. But I think for the demonstration purpose, I think this already presented you like my entire workflow. All right, this is the end of the demo. I hope you have learned some stuff. This wraps up this episode of Super Art Power Hour. Please stay tuned. More episodes are coming. And in the meantime, remember to check out the old episodes. Lots of cool stuff there. Until next time, power up.